Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much. An overwhelming support and sign up for today's webinar today to go over measures with MIPS reporting. So measuring up with MIPS reporting, some of the new changes, new measures, and new opportunities available to you. We are joined today, awesomely enough, by our measures team. We have Tara Kalra, who is our lead measure developer, and Josh Hall, who is a software engineer. Both have been with the company for a long time, know MIPS measures inside and out, and can really go into some pretty in-depth levels if you're very interested at another time. Today, they will go over some of the basics of how everything works. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Mike Lewis. I am the sales director here at HealthMonix, and I will be guiding us through this as well as being in touch with you after if you have any questions. On to the next page. With that, if you take a look at your GoToWebinar widget that you have there, there are two sections I want to call your attention to. The first one is the question section, having the ability to ask questions to our team. This is a full webinar with lots of information, so there is opportunity that we won't get to the questions section. However, if we don't reach your question, we will be getting back in touch with you by the end of the week with an answer to your questions or a direction of where to go look for it. And the second part there is the handouts. I have included the handout for today's session as well as some other information about the MIPSpro product. And you will, at the end of this call this afternoon, receive not only that same document if you don't get a chance to download it now, but you will also receive a copy of this recording that you can watch at your leisure or pass on to your fellow team members that may want to get a good listen as well. So please ask your questions. I love when I get questions and I love the opportunity to answer them later. So without further ado, we're going to hop right into quality measures, and I am going to bring on Mr. Josh Hall. Welcome.
Hi. So yeah, today we're going to start off just taking a look at quality measures as an overview. Dive into that, then we're going to take a look to see, okay, what's new for 2023? And once we get a sense of new and upcoming changes for 2023, we'll actually dive into a measure flow and get to really know what goes into how a measure is calculated and how MIPSpro handles that in a smooth process. So what are quality measures? So quality measures have been an initiative from CMS for years now, and they're kind of the backbone of MIPS quality reporting. At their core, they're just standardized tools used to assess and improve patient care. All measures are designed to be quantifiable, so we want a way to evaluate the delivery of healthcare services and measure outcomes consistently and meeting doctors where they are in their practices. Quality measures, they identify gaps in care, they drive performance and improvements in healthcare quality and patient safety. To the right, you can see there are 5 main domains of quality measures. They cover clinical effectiveness, patient experience, patient safety, care coordination, and population health. So measures overall, they hit each of these different areas. So depending on your specialty and practice, there's certain of these areas might be more applicable to you. So why do they matter? Well, measures are one of the primary tools that we have that drive value-based care. Value-based care is where reimbursement is tied to the quality and value of the services provided. So when I go into the doctor and I have a visit, we want those doctors to care not only about treating our patients well, but the reasons behind that in order to get value out of those visits and that we feel comfortable that, yes, these doctors are giving us the highest quality care. So measures help do that. They help deliver high quality care. They help improve the patient experience once you're in the office, in the OR, wherever you might be. And they also help reduce costs, which is another big deal. Measures encourage the providers to adopt these evidence-based practices. As doctors, nurses, practitioners start utilizing measures, they can start seeing gaps in care, which we'll also see later in the webinar. Measures also implement care coordination strategies within practices and providers, and they help engage in quality improvement initiatives within these practices. So what are some new measures for 2023? So every year there are new measures that are developed, and the point of developing these new measures is we want to say, hey, what measures exist or measures may exist for certain providers, practices, specialties that don't have measures that meet them where they are, or maybe there are measures that are refining previous measures that are now obsolete. So for 2023, some of the new measures that are going to be the most popular for this year certainly are measures 487, screening for social drivers of health. We'll be talking about health equity later in the webinar. So this is the first measure that's focused on health equity. We also have measure 493, adult immunization status. This is a measure that takes two measures that are going to be only in MVPs this year, measures 110 and 111, and it combines a bunch of all of the immunizations together under one measure, such as influenza, pneumococcal, etc. We also see some measures here that meet specialties that might not have had measures for them before, such as 45 and 46 for dermatology and 49 for AKD. So again, why are there new measures developed? We need to keep pace with advancements in healthcare and address emerging priorities. So priorities change year to year with advancements in technology, healthcare, medicine. New measures are developed and to really keep providers accountable for new advancements. They reflect evolving evidence-based practices and align with the changing landscape of the healthcare delivery. The introduction of measures also ensures that the reporting captures the latest best practices and areas of improvement. And by incorporating these new measures, organizations can demonstrate their commitment to quality improvement and staying current. So as I noted before, two examples of the new measures that meet a specialty that didn't have them before are related to dermatology. So both of these measures will help address past and current concerns of dermatologists who previously haven't had a breadth of measures to choose from when they report. So for example, within these measures, if chronic pruritus isn't treated correctly, it can have a large impact on quality of life. These problems can go anywhere from depression to global distress. So our two new measures this year are dermatology related, and they look at adult patients diagnosed with moderate to severe psoriasis and dermatitis. They're designed to evaluate whether patients show significant improvement in itch severity by considering both the patient's voice and their experience. So the hope that these two new measures will bring is that they'll impact the current standard of care to meaningfully improve patient health and decrease the cost for these patients. We're also can take a brief look at some of the measures that were removed this past year. At the bottom, we can see two of these measures are 110 and 111 that were heavily used prior. These have been removed from traditional MIPS, and these are the influenza and pneumococcal vaccinations. We'll talk about MVPs if we have time at the last part of this webinar, but essentially they can be reported in separate groups of measures, but you can't select them on their own for MIPS reporting this year. Some notable removed quality measures include measure 76 and 119, which have been around for a while, along with some measures that were just released last year related to lumbar fusion. So occasionally measures are removed because there isn't enough people using these measures. They can also be removed because they're topped out, which means that they're doing so well at this point in time that they're not really measuring the population accurately anymore or meaningfully. So if everyone's acing the test, it's not really giving us a lot of data to go off of. Measure changes for 2023. Here's a brief overview of when we look at changes, we want to say, okay, looking at the broad scope, how many actually have substantive changes? So we can say it's almost 50% of the measures this year had a substantive change. Some have just text changes, maybe definitions that help define a measure. And then we have some minimal changes in there as well. A few of these that have substantive changes include 226. It's one of our favorite measures here at HealthMonix. All the denominator exceptions have been removed this year for 226. Other examples of substantive changes would be removing denominator exclusions, adding additional submission criteria, anything that really drastically might change how the measure is reported. Some examples of minor changes that measures often see are age changes. So for measure 113, all it did was increase the range for who should be applicable to have a colorectal cancer screening. So now it's 45 to 75 instead of 50 to 75. Also, certain language might be important to be added to measures. So for example, for 378 and 379, these ECQM measures have additional language to make sure these are only reported by dentists. Also, a bunch of measures just have negligible changes, and these differences don't really have an impact on how they're reported or scored, but we always need to note these as well. These might be a code here or there, which potentially could impact reporting, but often it's just a change in description, definition, some way to make the measure more clear for people who are using it. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Tara, who's going to start diving into how measures are calculated within MIPSpro and in general.
Thanks, Josh. Today, I'm going to spend some time going through the logic of when it comes to MIPS measures and going through the details and hopefully giving some clarity as to really what MIPSpro, our product here at HealthMonix, does provide as far as measures are related. So as part of each measure specification document, CMS does provide a measure flow diagram which illustrates the step-by-step logic for each measure. This can also be thought of as an order of operations, and MIPSpro does focus on presenting this data clearly to the user so that it's able to be interpreted with ease. In addition, MIPSpro provides optimal performance when drilling into the data. So the flow of measures, it generally takes 4 steps, as you can see in the graphic to the right. First, we look for data that identifies a patient as being eligible for the measure. If there's no data, or we don't find data to indicate that a patient should be looked at for a specific measure, MIPSpro doesn't activate that measure. If we do find data to indicate a patient should be eligible, we then activate that measure and we go through the subsequent steps. And this is a way that we optimize both the user interface and the performance for the user. Next, we look for patients that have denominator exclusions. If they have criteria to exclude them from a measure, we then don't look for subsequent criteria because we know they are no longer eligible for the measure. Once we pass that step of exclusions, we move on to looking at all eligibility criteria. And once all the eligibility criteria, which usually lends itself to CPT codes and diagnoses codes, procedure codes, HCPCS, so forth, we then move into looking for if the eligible population at the patient level has the numerator quality action to make that patient be identified as met or not met for the measure. And we'll go into that status, the status definitions shortly. I mentioned measure activation. So in MIPSpro, there's 2 ways that you can activate a measure. And the first way is that you can open it manually. There is a checkbox which you as a user can state that you believe this patient is eligible for the measure, and you can go in and manually update that visit for a patient. Or we can take data that we get through some process where we upload the data, and if there's criteria met to make the visit eligible, the measure will automatically activate for that date of service. I do want to make note that if the patient does not meet the age or gender requirements, even if they do have subsequent eligible criteria based on the measure, that patient hasn't truly met all eligibility criteria, and will not get activated. And then we will not be displaying that visit for the patient. So what does the display look like? The display here we see is one that shows different ways that we can categorize a visit. You'll see rows with symbols in it, circles with lines through it, half red circles, or you'll also see rows without any symbols. The symbols indicate that the visit has been activated and the resulting status is shown. If the row is blank, then that is a date of service found for the patient, but there's no criteria to activate that patient. MIPSpro shows that if a patient is not met, identified by that yellow circle, and it will also show if the patient is met, which is a circle with a green check mark in it that's not shown in this image. If a visit has been activated but doesn't meet full eligibility criteria, then you'll see a circle with a line going through it. And if a patient is eligible but doesn't have complete information to complete the status of the numerator quality action, you'll have an incomplete status, which is this half circle with red in it. This is the MIPSpro UI. It's really so you can get a snapshot of all the measures that are selected. You can see it in the top row with the measure ID, and the patients are on the left-hand side. And you can see the status by measure for each patient across every measure for each date of service. We talked about denominator exclusions. So denominator exclusions are the criteria that would render a patient basically not as being appropriate for a measure. A common one we see is, for example, if a patient is hospice. If a patient is in hospice, their standard of care does veer from the traditional standard of care requirements, so it would be inappropriate to measure them on traditional CQMs. In this slide, we do have an example of a measure that requires foot exams. And the exclusion for this measure would be that a patient that had bilateral lower extremity amputations, they would not be included as part of the eligible population. Once you exclude that measure population, you are then left with those patients that we look for eligibility criteria for. I do want to make note, and you'll see it with an asterisk here, we look for exclusions first in MIPSpro. Again, because if they do have exclusion criteria, there's no need to check if that patient is eligible. And again, that's going to increase efficiency within our system and make things run faster on your side. And next, we go to the denominator. So the denominator is the population that is identified as requiring the numerator quality action for that measure. We have an image on the right over here, and you can see that the population is trimmed down to those that truly should be looked at for that numerator action. So first we start with the age requirements. For example, a pediatric measure would only look for patients under the age of 18 years old. Next, we add on gender requirements, and further whittling down, we'll add in requirements for diagnoses and or procedures. In the end, we're left with that innermost circle that leaves us with the final denominator population. And from this population, we then start looking for numerator quality actions. So when I say numerator quality actions, there is a term that's called denominator exceptions. And what that means is that once you're in the denominator, you have a population that technically could be exempt from the numerator quality action if that quality action is not provided. So this step in the process allows for the adjustment for performance for providers who in general have a higher risk population. It also allows providers to have a say if their patient truly does require that numerator quality action. So while these patients are removed from the denominator, they are still reported. And the general categories for exceptions tend to be medical reasons, patient reasons, or system reasons. And our last step in the process flow for a measure is calculating the numerator. To say it another way, we're identifying that if the expected outcome is identified for a patient or a process is followed, dictated by the measure, or if a procedure has been provided to the identified population that requires the numerator requirement for the measure. So the ratio of patients with the numerator quality action compared to the denominator population results in the performance rate. On the right-hand side, we do have another graphic to assist in this concept. So you'll see at the upper right, we have the denominator, which is the patients that met that clinical action or outcome. And it is divided by the numerator, which is the patients who fall into the initial population and do not have a denominator exclusion. And then we also do take out the denominator exceptions. And again, the denominator exceptions could be reported, but are not going to ding a provider or a user because the numerator quality action was not provided. This ratio leaves you with the percentage of eligible patients meeting the measure. Reporting periods are also a feature that is required by measures. If we go to the next slide, we will see that there are different types of reporting periods by measure. The default is the current full reporting year, which is January 1st of the current year, 2023, through December 31st of 2023. However, some measures do have different reporting periods, and the deviation from the traditional time frame is applicable when a measure needs to allow the numerator action to occur during the said reporting period. So for example, if a numerator action can occur within 30 days after an eligible episode, we'll identify eligible episodes up until the end of November to allow the numerator to be met all the way up until the end of December. Here's a list of some non-traditional reporting periods. And the ones that fall into the example I just said is third from the bottom on the right-hand side. And we'll see that the measures that fall within, that end on November 30th are measures 138, 354, and so forth. MIPSpro does have the ability to bring in multiple types of coding systems, and we're able to have a lot of flexibility with the way that we map codes. So MIPSpro does handle what we call at Healthmonics the CMS standard codes, which includes CPT codes, HCPCS, and ICD-10 codes. Additionally, MIPSpro can interpret what we have defined as non-standard codes. So these include, but are not limited to, SNOMED codes, LOINC codes, RX norms, CVX codes. In addition to what's not on this list, we also look at NDC codes. We're able to create custom codes also for a client if they do have limitations with their own data integration. We have a team that can help with that. So this allows MIPSpro to report on data that reaches beyond the standard billing data. MIPSpro can also ingest discrete data such as actual blood pressure values, weight values, score from specific diagnostic tools as identified from the GAD-7 and the PHQ-9 on the right-hand side. And while these types of data are mostly found in ECQMs or QCDR, mappings to these codes can also be found in our CQMs to make the measures more robust. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to my colleague Josh to continue on.
Sure, so there's a few other elements that we want to chat about measures, and one of these is the reporting frequency. So every measure has certain submission frequency requirements which dictate how often and in what priority they should be submitted. This can be called a measure's reporting frequency, and in MIPSpro, the tool we've created to handle this is called a measure tag. In essence, for every measure, there's a certain frequency for how often those visits ought to be reported. And MIPSpro handles all that behind the scenes. Down here, we have a little snapshot of the specification from CMS. They have some interesting names that we've gotten used to over the years. So for example, patient process means, hey, this patient's reported once per year, and you take the most advantageous quality code throughout the year. We have ones like patient intermediate, which is the most recent code will be used. Also, patient periodic. So some measures say, hey, you want to be reporting this every 30 days or every 60 days. So that is specific to a measure that might be applicable to that. There's also many measures that you need to report it every single time you find an eligible instance. So that would be a visit measure. Procedure and episode are similar to that. So every single time you have an episode or every single time you have a procedure, that counts in your performance rate. And the last thing we're going to chat about are multiple strata. So traditionally, every measure only has one performance rate that you're measuring. However, oftentimes you want to split up a measure into different strata. Some of these strata would be simply to, hey, we want to chop up this measure and take a look at different age ranges. So below you see from measure 370, depression remission at 12 months, we want to look at both adolescent patients and adult patients. So it's as simple as stratifying the population by age. Other measures might do it by gender, or hey, if you had this procedure done in this way, we want to be able to identify a performance rate from a different way. Often when we're stratifying measures, you also have an overall performance rate for which someone could be graded at. And all of these strata and these performance rates are sent to CMS so that CMS can say, hey, let's take a look at this measure from different angles and get a broader view of what these measures are. So that's it for measures and how they're calculated, along with diving into how they're built out. I'm going to pass it over to Mike, who can start chatting about really one of the great things that they're integrating this year for Measure 487, which is health equity.
Thank you very much, Josh. Really appreciate it. Great insight from the two of you. And I'm sure we're going to have some questions coming your way at some point as well. So be prepared and stay on board. This is a great time if you have any additional questions, if you want to ask the two experts on the phone today. To get them into me here, and I'll see if I have an opportunity to go through with them. They flew through that, so we may have some time to go over that. So a couple things when it comes to health equity. I've shared in a number of other webinars that I have done that CMS has made a point to show that health equity will be amongst the most important things moving forward with any of these measures and with this program. No less than 400 or 500 times was it said in the final rule that health equity will have an impact no matter what program that you're in and how you can include it in your MIPS and quality reporting. So health equity through measures for MIPS, there is a measure 487 that is for achieving health equity. That is a new measure that I highly recommend you take a look at to see if you can answer that and start it now. I do think that measure will become mandatory in other programs moving forward, as there is a lot of opportunity for CMS to not only gather information, but to show how there is a disparity in healthcare throughout the United States and be able to put the right people and programs in place to fight that. Health equity is a measure that has not been included before. They use multiple things to qualify for health equity in the ACO program. It has to do with either dual eligibility for Medicare and Medicaid, or they do it based upon a zip code rate and where patients are coming from. Screening for social drivers of health measures requires that patients be screened for all of them by identifying concerns and helping patients improve their health. Providers can help them produce better health outcomes, not incomes, outcomes. All right. But I have spent some time on the health equity side. We do have blogs as well as the ACO webinar goes a lot more in detail. So measure improvement and working with the health monics through our programs to help build a better quality reporting program. Monitoring performance on a regular basis is a number one in my book since my consulting days. Really being able to understand where things are on a daily basis from day one. Our measures are up here at Health Monics so that you can take a look at where you stand throughout the year, be able to compare providers and practices to each other to understand where you need to go, what information you need to do, and impacts on your workflow as you move forward. Understanding and driving performance improvement in your gaps. There's still time. It's June. We're not halfway through the year at this point. We're getting there. But as our clients are working through all of this, they are working with our account management teams here to make sure that they are driving performance improvement. And one of the best ways to do that is to start by understanding and identifying where your misses are. Is it a provider? Is it a certain measure? Is there some documentation within your EHR or your chart that you are not getting the information where it needs to be? We've seen everything here from providers taking pictures of lab reports and putting it in the system all the way to creating their own workflows that aren't eligible to being captured. So identifying those as early in the year as possible is imperative to us getting off the board. Take your next steps to maximize your return on investment, maximize what you get out of your quality measures. So choosing the right measures. I did a webinar last month on measures to choose from to take a look at measures that aren't capped out, measures that are more applicable to your specialty, as well as measures that you control instead of being measures that the patient controls. And having the ability to score well in those measures is important as well. Internal meeting with your staff. Everybody needs to understand the importance of MIPS in 2023. That goes from everybody from front desk to managers and the providers. All need to understand what your goals are, what your anticipated scores are going to be, and how to get to those scores. And getting the right tools in place, whether it's your EHR submission platform like MIPSpro, billing company, consultants, telehealth program. Everybody has a little bit to do with these programs, so getting all that into place is really important. MIPSpro offers live dashboards and drill down capabilities, helping identify those gaps that I talked about, performance improvement opportunities, score optimization, and outlier detection, understanding where your misses are and being able to get you there. We have a US-based support and integration teams that are here to help you reduce the burden of quality reporting, allowing what you do best, provide the highest quality healthcare to your patients. Stay tuned for our next webinar. We will have a number of webinars coming up over the summer. Bringing in special guests from outside of Health Monics to do some webinars as well, to incorporate them in our into your workflow to help make sure that you're maximizing your potential. If you have any questions or concerns that you didn't bring up on today's call, you can, of course, always reach out to me. There's my email address and my phone number, and I can get the questions on to the right people at the right time. We have a couple questions that came in, and I'm going to see if I can get Tara and Josh to answer a couple of them. So my first question to you guys comes from one of our attendees, and by seeing all of these changes in quality data, where do you see the future of these quality measures going? I know outcomes are, for me, I know outcomes are more important outcome measures, but where do you see them moving forward? Let's start off with Tara.
Sorry, I was muted.
No
Um,
problem.
so that's a great question. Definitely outcomes is the goal for CMS to get to. um, there's a few different pathways that I see measures going. It is really trying to get specialists who don't have appropriate measures or ones that really reflect their patient population who are struggling to understand or how they can report, getting measures that are there and out there to them, getting measures that have been out there for a very long time and really have addressed a gap in care and taking that next step further. From taking a process measure that's currently in place and translating it into outcome measures. The other driver that I see happening is CQMs use a lot of G codes, and it is just becoming more and more important that we use codes that are directly used through billing practices. And that's why MIPSpro does not just rely on G codes, but we're leveraging many different types of code types to get different ways of getting the correct eligible populations and the correct numerator actions being identified. Josh, do
Yeah,
you have anything to add?
the
Mhm.
other big thing, which you may have mentioned a little bit, is more and more measures are based on outcomes and not just processes. Um, a big push, and you kind of saw those. I mentioned previously a few measures that were removed were these lumbar fusion measures, which were outcome measures, but they were just difficult to report. And often outcome measures are because you're often taking maybe surveys before and after a procedure, or you're having to take certain scores and get an average of these scores across patients instead of just saying, well, did you do the thing? Um, so CMS and measure stewards are trying to create measures that are not only identifying outcomes, so we can say, okay, we truly see that a patient improved, but also trying to design measures that are easier to use, that aren't such a burden on providers.
Great. Thank you very much. Um, as a follow-up question, and this is more strategy maybe than talking about the actual measures. How many measures do you think the best is for you to be reporting on or tracking throughout the year? And do you see a benefit in tracking, 15 or 20 measures? Start off with Josh on that one.
Sure. I would say, when you're reporting measures to CMS, you're choosing your top 6, and you want to really get a good view of the measures that you're reporting throughout the year. And within MIPSpro, there's no limit to how many measures you can select. So we really encourage people to select at least 15 measures to track throughout the year. Um, and not only measures that might be applicable to your specialty, maybe some more general measures that you might not have suspected that would be applicable. And this gives you a better overview of how your practice is doing. And it might even identify certain areas of improvement or certain things you're doing well that you didn't even know. Anything you want
Great.
to add, Tar?
Yes, to springboard off of that, that's exactly what we try to do is we take in all your data. You've selected this breadth of measures, and from that, you're able to hone in onto those that really do show you where exactly what Josh said, where you may be falling behind and trying to understand why, identifying areas where you're exceeding at or excelling and you didn't even realize it. And it gives you a very transparent view into your practice based on just data dumps that we get from you. It's not, we don't expect you to know everything up front and select the appropriate measures. So it's giving you a starting point, almost like you're studying for the test and getting ready for the final, and then like the submission time is your final exam.
Great. All right. This is an interesting question, something I've always wanted to know too. What's the hardest part of creating the measures?
That's a great question. That's an interesting question. So, really, each measure is its own being. Each measure has its own specific requirements, and it's really being able to take the specification that's provided by CMS and getting at the true intention of that measure correctly. You want to make sure that the patients that you're identifying are the ones that truly are the ones that need that numerator action. And then when you're identifying that numerator action, it's correctly being identified. It's the interpretation of a medical / technical document and turning it into a product which we take data in and present to you a report card. I keep going back to the metaphor of an exam and studying and finally, because that's kind of how I approach this industry.
Yeah, and it's always a little bit more challenging when there's numerous strata. So, if a measure is saying, hey, you need to chop this 10 ways to Sunday, of course, that'll take a little bit more time, and we want to make sure we get those things right. Often, as we noted before, we're trying to shift away from G codes within measures because these G codes are rarely used within EHRs. So one of the big things too is, hey, this is a very commonly used measure. Let's make sure that we're getting the breadth of codes that are available, say, and is there an ECQM measure available that has the codes? Is there a HEDIS measure that has codes? What other sources can we do to make sure that we are covering all of the codes that might be applicable to a denominator or numerator so we can report it accurately?
Great, thank you. All right, so there were a couple questions based on specialties as well as what they can do for your individual specialties when choosing measures and so forth. You can utilize our homepage for most of those questions. We have the webinars available, the previous webinars, as I mentioned, the webinar on measure choosing. There is on there the ability for you to watch any of the old webinars that we've put out. The other thing is that there is also on that homepage the ability to take a look at the MIPS measures and the measure sets by CMS, being able to see what you are eligible for. Inside the MIPSpro program, that makes it even easier as you can search by codes once you are a customer of ours. Search by codes to understand which measures are more applicable to what you do. So before I do head out, I have my personal question for you guys, and that is, if you can tell CMS one thing about quality reporting and the struggles that providers go through and practitioners go through that they can make a change for, what would it be? And I'll let each one of you answer that, and then we can get out of here.
I would say that I would ask for more what's the word I want to say? I want to say like accuracy. I want more definitions, more definitions into what exactly timeframes are associated, and what is more details as to how to identify the correct buckets of patients.
And Josh?
It's a little bit related to that. So there are so many measures out there, and there are many different measure stewards who have helped design these measures. We found over the years there's often a disconnect between what the intent of a measure steward is and what CMS might believe is implemented for this. So one of the challenges we find is having to communicate back and forth with the measure steward, asking questions because there might have been an oversight, or we're like, well, how did this get approved as a new measure if it's missing this, that, and the other thing? So often there is a learning period almost when a new measure is adopted that we unfortunately, as a vendor, are the ones finding flaws in measures before you would think they would come through the pipeline. So it would be awesome if there's just more communication between measure stewards and CMS. We know that the process for getting a measure approved is a pretty lengthy process, and you know there's only so much time that you can devote to that. But it would be a great boon to everyone um, if people were just a little bit more on the same page, especially when there's changes year to year. So for example, for measure 226 this year, all the exceptions got removed. That measure's been here since the beginning almost. So, and all of a sudden, all the exceptions are gone. So that's just kind of a big deal to make these drastic changes to measures over the years. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, you know, we just see it. So that's kind of the big thing for me.
I thought I gave you guys both a layup that you missed on this. I thought both of you would say, give us the measures before Christmas Eve.
Oh, that too.
Well,
I
That
thought
too. Yes.
I thought that would be the one, and that's also very interesting, everybody, that you know CMS gets all of these measures together and then delivers us the final specifications so late in the year that the Tara and Josh are working like 90 million hours a week towards the end of the year to make sure that those measures are up and running for our customers. So thank you both for joining us on this call, and thank you very, very much to all the attendees. I look forward to speaking with everybody in the near future and joining our further calls. So with that, I'm going to let everybody go and have a wonderful day, all right? Thank you. Thanks, Josh.
thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.